Say it out loud. Filipino. You've written that word on forms 1,000 times. Said it in school. Said it to strangers abroad who asked where you're from. I'm Filipino. But almost nobody ever explains where that word actually came from. And once you find out, it changes how you see your own identity. Because that word wasn't created by your ancestors, it was created by the people who colonized them. The people who lived on these islands for 50,000 years, before Spain ever showed up, were never once called Filipino. So, what were they called instead? Stick around, because the answer is bigger than most people realize. It was 1543. A Spanish explorer named Ruy López de Villalobos was sailing through Southeast Asia, looked at these islands, and named them Las Islas Filipinas, after Prince Philip of Spain, who was 16 years old at the time, had never set foot here, and never would in his entire life. Just like that, a civilization that had been developing for 50,000 years got named after a teenage prince who never saw it. Here's the part most Filipinos never learn. When Spain first used the word Filipino, it didn't refer to the people who already lived here. It referred to Spanish settlers who happened to be born in the Philippines. Spaniards, not your ancestors, your actual ancestors, were called something else. Indios, the same label Spain slapped on indigenous people across every colony it controlled, from Mexico to Peru. To here, the people who built Tondo, Butuan, and the sultanates of the south were never called Filipino by Spain. They were placed under a colonial label, positioned beneath the settlers who had invaded their land. So if not Filipino, what did people call themselves? Before Spain forced one name onto everyone, they didn't need a single label, because they already had names, specific ones, tied to real places and real pride. If your family traces back to Manila, your ancestors were Tagamaynila, people of Manila, not generically Filipino, not even generically Tagalog, but people of a specific kingdom and community. If your roots are in Cebu, your ancestors called themselves Bisaya, a name old enough that linguists still argue about where it came from, with some tracing it back toward the ancient Srivijaya Empire of Sumatra. If your family comes from Mindanao, your ancestors might have been Maguindanao, people of the flooded plains, or Tausug, people of the current, or Marananao, people of the lake. Every one of those names was a statement about where you were from, what land you belonged to, what water you sailed, what kingdom you served. Your Lola from the Visayas was Bisaya before she was ever labeled Filipino. Your Lolo from Ilocos was Ilocano first. Those identities are older than the concept of the Philippines itself. Here's something that reframes the whole story. China knew about these islands for over 1,000 years before Spain arrived, and not in some vague sense. They documented specific kingdoms by name in official imperial records. Around 972 CE, Chinese records describe a prosperous kingdom called Ma'ai, which most historians place in Mindoro, described as an organized society with multiple settlements and serious trade ties to China. In 1001 CE, Chinese records mention the kingdom of Butuan, noting that its ruler sent a formal diplomatic mission to the imperial court. The Chinese officials who received that mission wrote with genuine astonishment about how wealthy Butuan was. Wealthy enough, they noted, that even servants wore gold. By the 1300s, Chinese records describe Luzon as a significant trading partner of the Ming dynasty. Chinese merchants didn't refer to the people here as Filipinos. They referred to them by kingdom, by ruler, by trading reputation, because that's exactly what your ancestors were to China, not an unnamed island population, waiting to be found, but known trading partners in one of the most advanced commercial networks of the ancient world for 1,000 years before Spain ever appeared. There's more. Arab merchants also knew of these islands. Centuries before Spain arrived, 9th century Arab geographic texts describe island communities in Southeast Asia matching the Philippine archipelago, describing the people as sharp traders who understood the value of what they had and weren't easily taken advantage of. The Laguna copper plate, dated to around 900 CE, and the oldest known written document from the Philippines, is written in Old Malay but contains Arabic loanwords 600 years before Spain arrived. That means Arab language and culture had already reached these islands through long-running trade contact. Your ancestors were already linked into networks stretching across the Indian Ocean. Arab traders didn't call them Filipinos either. They called them people of the sea, skilled traders, worth returning to century after century, long before any European had any idea these islands existed. For roughly 300 years, Spain called indigenous Filipinos Indios, a label built specifically to keep them beneath the colonial hierarchy, below the settlers. Spain considered its equals, and for a long stretch, that system held. Then, in the 1800s, something shifted. A generation of educated Filipinos began reading not just what Spain handed them, but the material Spain had tried to keep buried: Chinese historical records, Arab geographic accounts, the Laguna copper plate, and oral traditions that had survived generations of colonial suppression. What they uncovered changed everything. Kingdoms that China had respected for a millennium, a civilization Arab merchants had crossed an ocean to trade with, gold craftsmanship rivaling anything produced in Europe, a history longer, deeper, and more complex than Spain had ever admitted. And they looked at the word Filipino, the label Spain had coined for its own settlers, and made a choice. They took it. Jose Rizal used it. Andres Bonifacio used it. The Katipunan used it. A word invented to describe colonizers became the word Filipinos used to declare their own sovereignty and humanity. Your ancestors didn't just endure colonization. They reached into the colonizer's own vocabulary, pulled out a word and rebuilt it into something Spain never intended it to become: a statement of pride. So what are you actually saying when you say, I am Filipino? You're saying, I am Tondaño, I am Butuanon, I am Bisaya, I am Tausug, I am Tagalog, I am Ilocano, I am Maguindanao, I am Lumad. I descend from kingdoms. China documented for 1,000 years I carry the legacy of people Arab merchants crossed oceans to trade with. I carry 50,000 years of history that existed long before any colonizer assigned a name to it. And I carry the defiance of ancestors who took a word never meant for them and turned it into something extraordinary. So when your Lolo says he's proud to be Filipino, he isn't celebrating a Spanish label. He's celebrating an act of reclamation. An entire people looking at everything colonization tried to erase and saying, we are still here. We have always been here, and we decide what this name means now. That's what Filipino actually means. Not what Spain intended, but what your ancestors made of it. Here's something else worth knowing. Spain colonized the Philippines for 333 years. Churches were built over temples. Baybayin was pushed aside for the Roman alphabet. Your ancestors were labeled Indios, and Spain told the world these islands belonged to them, but not everyone accepted that, not for a single day. In Mindanao, the Sultanate of Maguindanao met Spain with resistance, not passive resistance, actual armies, and a political structure organized enough that Spanish commanders reportedly wrote back to Manila saying these people could not be defeated. The Tausug of Sulu resisted Spanish control for over 200 years. While much of the archipelago was being renamed and reorganized under colonial rule, the Tausug held on to their original name, their faith, and their identity completely intact. Spain tried labeling them Moros, borrowing a term used for Muslims back in Spain, an attempt to frame them as outsiders on their own land. But the Tausug already had a name, people of the current, and no colonial power managed to erase it. Up in the mountains of Luzon, the Cordillera peoples, including the Igorot, built rice terraces, so advanced that engineers today still can't fully explain the construction methods used roughly 2,000 years ago. Spain sent missionaries into those mountains. Most never returned. The Igorot kept their name, their customs, their identity. While the lowlands were undergoing colonization, the highlands stayed largely untouched. So when people say colonization erased Filipino identity, point them to the Tausug, the Maguindanao, and the Igorot of Luzon. Some Filipinos never had to reclaim their identity because they never lost it. In the first place, before 1543, your ancestors were Tondeno, Butuanan, Bisaya, Tausug, Ilocano, Lumad, and dozens of other names, each one specific, each one tied to real history and real pride. China had known these names for 1,000 years. Wider trade networks had known these islands for centuries. Then Spain arrived and tried to flatten all of that into one colonial label. But your ancestors did something Spain never anticipated. They took that label and filled it with 50,000 years of history. The gold of Butuan, the seafaring power of Tondo, the resistance of Sulu, the defiance of Maguindanao, the courage of Lapu-Lapu, the revolutionary drive of Bonifacio and Rizal. They filled it until it meant something no colonizer could ever take back. Filipino was never Spain's word, and it was never a teenage prince's word either. It's yours, it always has been, and now you know exactly what it carries.